Yeah, I usually say that I'm a wordsmith,
Mhm.
or it's also odd because, in certain contexts, I'm just introduced as a scholar, in which I say, yes, but I'm also a writer. And when I'm introduced as a writer, I say, yes, but I'm also a scholar. So, but it's just basically, wordsmith, I think, summarize it all because I try to juggle all of these things. But at the end of the day, I also see connections between knowledge, writing, translating, and so on and so forth. So wordsmith to combine and summarize all of it. I borrowed it from Muhammad al-Maghud, the Syrian poet, because he has this thing about, which I appreciate because I think writers and others talk too much about inspiration and slip into this talk of the metaphysical, but it's all at the end of the day, it's labor. And this Muhammad al-Maghud used to say, I'm like a blacksmith. I go and I open my shop and I sit down and I do the work. I would say Al Jawahiri, the famous Iraqi poet, Mahmoud Darwish, Muzaffar al Nawab, Sargon Bolos, and from the other side, on this continent, Toni Morrison, James Baldwin, and Charles Simic, who died a few years ago, the Serbian American poet, and others, but these primarily. Al Jawahiri and Mahmoud Darwish, Muzaffar Nawab, definitely, and Sargon Bolos, I read extensively, and I've also, for both Darwish and Sargon Bolos, I've both translated their work into English and did research on them. So they've kind of, I'm haunted by them for obvious reasons. We might get into this later, but how does one write about a country that disintegrates or is disintegrating, or a country that one does not live in anymore and observes from a distance? But especially with the poets, I think because of growing up back in Iraq, when poetry in terms of school curricula and in general was very important and foundational. I mean, so yeah, and especially in the 80s before leaving, particularly Mahmoud Darwish and also Muzaffar Nawab for political reasons, because he was in exile and banned in Iraq, but his poems used to be smuggled through cassettes to us in Iraq. But I think that applies to all these Arab countries where even though Muzaffar Nawab was outside the literary establishment because of his politics, but, you know, we all, even here in the US with other Arabs, we all memorize and repeat his poems because they speak also to kind of major events in the region's history in the last 20, 30 years. For those of us who live in the diaspora, I think, there are different ways of dealing with or relating to the home country. I mean, this question haunts me as it haunts others, so much so that actually my last novel is about two Iraqi refugees who come to this country in different periods but have different attitudes to Iraq. One of them, like many immigrants, want to cut off and forget about the home country. That's because of his own painful experience, but also because of the racism and discrimination in this country and being pigeonholed and stereotyped. But the other character just cannot, he holds on to the memories, to the songs. And for me, the United States was involved in shaping me in so many ways. In that, first of all, my mother was American, but I was the youngest of three, and when I grew up, she had already mastered Arabic, so the influence of American culture was very minimal. But I mean, the United States was involved in shaping the lives of millions of Iraqis because it supported the dictatorship that we lived under for a very long time, and then it bombed the country back to the pre-industrial age in 1991. And so many of us, even those who never thought of leaving, I wanted to leave because I wanted more personal freedom. But this is in the 90s, this is when there is an explosion in the Iraqi diaspora and 3 million Iraqis leave Iraq to all over the world. But I think those of us even though the poets that I love and study and translate, Sargon Bolos, Saad Yusuf, Mahmoud Darwish, have all dealt with the meaning and the changing in the image and the meaning of home and homeland. And particularly Saad Yusuf, whose work is very important, even has a whole collection that I translated called Nostalgia, My Enemy. Sorry, I'm going overboard, but his idea was that distance and nostalgia makes you, exacerbates this imaginary, solid, unchanging view of what home is. But time changes everything, and the physical shape changes all the time, but especially during war and political turmoil. So with Iraq, going back, of course, even though I had prepared myself that the country had changed so much because of the brutal embargo that really destroyed the social fabric and the economy, but I was still shocked when I went in 2003. So there's always this readjustment of what used to exist and what exists now. And beyond me, this is very important politically and socially in every country, whereby there is this notion of whose version of the past is the one we should try to recreate. Did it even ever exist? So this tension and dialectics between home and the diaspora and the US and Iraq, and it continues to shape how I think, what I teach also, because the United States is still, as we speak now, involved in Iraq militarily and so on and so forth. So, but I mean, how should I say this? I always go back to a very foundational trope in Arabic poetry, which is al-wuquf ala al-atlal, standing before the ruins. And although many Arabs, for various reasons, think that that's, old, hackneyed and whatnot, but I discovered later in life that that trope is actually foundational to human beings and our species. And how do we relate to history and change and time? Time and history change everything. But in a way, it is a cliche, but I feel it and know it, is that actually the text, the novels and the writings have become this fascinating space where I can recreate and imagine, or let's say preserve certain memories. But also readers, not only from Iraq, but from elsewhere, can vicariously live other lives and visit cities that perhaps no longer exist or don't exist the way they used to. So that's a kind of solace, and that's why I think many of us write and read. I mean, I think there are fragments of home, because to be totally honest, I mean, I and others have written about it and experienced it. When I was living in Iraq, I was alienated. I was alienated because of the family constraints and societal constraints and because of dictatorship. And I always wanted to leave because I didn't want to live under dictatorship. But the moment I left Iraq on the bus to Amman, Jordan, I cried because I knew intuitively that as I leave, I was gaining a lot, but I was losing something that was irretrievable. And this is a question, I mean, especially for those of us who don't live in Syria or Iraq or Palestine. So I don't know. I mean, there is a physical place called home and homeland that we return to. Yeah. But there is this constellation of songs and words and smells and scents and poems and people that can be at certain moments and places in the farthest point on earth be recreated, where I feel at home when I visit one of my friends or when I listen to a certain song and so on. And when I go back to Baghdad now, even though the family home was sold for various reasons, and I actually don't have any more relatives. Most of my relatives live, or all of them live outside of Iraq. Mm-hmm. But walking down the city where I stay at a hotel, I feel at home because of everything that is home. The language, the scents, the physical space that has changed. So, yeah. It's always interrupted. I mean, I don't know. Maybe I'm a pessimistic person, but it's these moments. It's not a continuous, uninterrupted state. There are moments when you feel at home, and then they're, of course, followed by moments. And I'm sure where we live in this country, where after 34 years, there are moments when I almost on a daily basis when I wonder, why am I here? No, and then a community, I think is very important, especially in these times. So that's where, there are critiques of nationalism. Of course, nationalism at certain points is important for the defense of a place and of being, and also, but a sense of community, a community that comes together, and also where there's compassion and love and solidarity. These are the best aspects of our species. So, and there are ways of making strangers feel at home. I mean, in a way, generosity, and God knows. I mean, that's one thing that makes me feel at home here, not only from people from the Arab world, but people from the global south or others who have this generosity of heart and have this understanding and openness to, I think, one of the most, maybe I'm getting old and sentimental, but, this welcoming the stranger is, especially at a time when so many people are being displaced and we have, millions and millions of refugees, creating community, and it takes some imagination and creativity also. I don't decide, but to be honest, I think most of the poetry I write originally in Arabic, not in English. For a variety of reasons. Some of them are material reasons, I think, because, going to graduate school and being trained as an academic and a scholar and a literary critic, I think, that's oftentimes English tends to be the language of research and translation and all of that. But with somehow also, to speak of return, like when writing in Arabic, I have also access to a huge reservoir of poetry that I've accumulated throughout. But I always try to remind myself and others that, we live in a world, again, that is focuses a lot, despite all the brouhaha about connectivity and multiplicity, about one language, right? But wherever we are, there are always multiple languages, and there used to be much more. So for me, in a way, we grew up speaking a certain dialect at home that a lot of Christians in Iraq who are originally from northern Iraq speak, that was different from the Baghdadi dialect that we spoke out on the street and in the school. And my father and aunts who are, Chaldean denominationally, they spoke sometimes the dialect of Aramaic. And I was very curious, and even as a child, I didn't like the fact that they were switching to this different language. So I went around asking them about the meaning of words, and later to be disappointed that what they were talking about wasn't that exciting. But so I already grew up in a milieu where there are different registers, and was fascinated by the differences. Those of us who come to this country, of course, are switching on a daily basis when we speak to native speakers of Arabic and to our colleagues back and forth. But there is no decision. But the one thing that I can say is that for a variety of reasons, some of them may be unknown to me, that are just emotional and intuitive, that writing the poetry is always in Arabic. And the prose, the novels. I just, because also I think unconsciously, oftentimes, especially with novels, there is a certain audience. And I didn't want to be that writer who writes about the Arab world for a foreign audience. And I think sometimes with some writers, you can tell for whom they're writing. So the novels and the poems, I all write them first in Arabic. The essays and the op-eds, which, I started to write and speak publicly in 2002, right before the invasion of Iraq, where I, out of anger and frustration, of course, I felt that I had to, make interventions. So the essays, I do write them in Arabic sometimes, but in English, essays, scholarship, and translation. No, that's a great question, but it gets us into this complicated issue of, how literature and cultural production about the Arab world or the global South is largely marketed and distributed in this country, and I would say in the global North. So there is a certain set of parameters or certain themes and plots that you are expected to write, whether, we all know that. I don't want to belittle the exceptions, but it's, the grateful immigrant, the success story and whatnot. And early on, I didn't want to be that type of writer. And also, to be honest with you, I don't want this to be misunderstood, but I'd say, I naturally want to be read by everyone. But because of the specific history of Iraq and what it went through in terms of dictatorships and war and all of that, there's just a large swath of history. I think the same applies to Syria that is not written about. Plus, I, lived 23 years of my life in Iraq, and there is a wealth of memories and themes that continue to haunt me. But I want everyone to read me, but I have noticed from the responses that for readers in Arabic and of Arabic, these novels and poems are more than just entertainment. They are viscerally important because they engage with history and with themes that are often silenced or marginalized by official history. So I've come to think of readers of Arabic, also who don't have access to English, and readers in Iraq and the region as my front row audience. There is another audience as well. Also, I think, to be honest, I miss, when I first came to this country, I think of myself as a linguistic being. And the first thing that I missed was the Arabic language. We were speaking in 1991, before the internet, before satellite channels. I think it's difficult to imagine for younger generations where all of a sudden the language that you speak and dream in is no longer there. You don't see the letters of the alphabet, and there are no newspapers. So also writing in Arabic is going back to that language and connecting with it and so on and so forth. For other works, I translate texts that I really love and feel that this should be available in English. Mm-hmm. This is how it started out early on. I would read a poem or a section that I was so taken by that with friends or those close to me, I was like, I have to tell you what this says in English. So it's the poets that I really love and think they should be in English. I think there's a saying that is either by Derrida or attributed to Walter Benjamin that a text is in mourning until it's translated. So there is this joy of giving a text an afterlife, a life in a new language. And there is also something very selfish because translation allows the translator to internalize the music and the style of the writer or the poet. For my own novels, the first novel I started to translate, then I was involved in making this documentary about Baghdad and had to go to Iraq. So a friend, Rebecca Johnson, suggested that she would do the translation. So she took it on. But when I finished the Corpse Washer, which is not the original title, I should say, it's the title is The Pomegranate Alone, but the publisher insisted on this title. I like every novel, I was living with this novel and its characters for 2-3 years, And there is always this postpartum depression when you finish a huge project, because then all of a sudden and so I wanted to go back to that world of the novel. I missed the characters, but also I sensed and I knew that the novel itself, whether the dialogue that is in the Iraqi dialect or a lot of the specifics about the rituals of washing the body, or all of these expressions that were, either going to be misread by the translator, or the translator was going to bother me with so many questions, so I might as well do it myself. But also with other novels, you might ask, most of the novels or all of them deal with themes that are quite sad and melancholic. So also sometimes it's, as much as I want to go back to that world, it's also emotionally taxing to go back to it. So sometimes I cop out. And one of the novels that as soon as I published it, the translator contacted me and said, I'm interested in translating this. And I said, sure, go ahead. But the last novel, which in Arabic is called Khuzama, and is coming out next year in the States under the title of Loss and Lavender, I translated myself. So from now on, I will translate all of my writing so that I take responsibility. Sometimes it's strange how I think, one has a different persona in different languages, but also as great as translation is, there are certain turns of phrase that are untranslatable, really. I mean, you could put a footnote, but also editors and publishers are against saddling a literary text with footnotes. And sometimes I make certain changes because I don't think not many, that this would have the same effect it would have in English. Or like this last novel, it mostly takes place in the United States. So and I wrote it initially in Arabic, and there are certain things that needed to be illuminated for a reader of Arabic, but for an English or an American reader, they wouldn't be. But it's very, very, very few things. I think it also has to do with I'm the type of writer who unfortunately takes a long time thinking about the characters and what's going to happen, so that when I sit down to write, a lot of the events and the characters have almost formed and become real. So it becomes difficult for me later to change things. But there is another layer also for all of us translators, is that there are editors who oftentimes or always don't know the original language. And they're thinking, it depends on which editor and which publishing house. There's even there's been scholarship about this. Again, the problematic of American and British publishers trying to domesticate translations from non-European languages, whereby once I was told by an editor, this doesn't happen in an American novel. And I told them, well, this is not an American novel. This is a novel written in Arabic about Iraq. But that gives you an idea of the back and forth and the tussle with trying to explain that, yes. And it also has to do with two major different approaches to translation, whether, domestication or foreignization, meaning this is another issue that's important beyond translation, whether I remember in translating a certain novel where the editor also wanted to keep the word Allah as it is and not translate it into God, which I refused, because that, of course, politically and culturally is just another conscious or unconscious attempt at kind of demonizing all things Islamic and Arabic, and, keeping this unfathomable, unexplainable, foreign-sounding entity that's simply capital G-O-D.
Right.
Wallahu alam. I was busy for 4 or 5 years trying to finish my dissertation and get a job. So I didn't have time to And then I had some space, but it was already 2004. And as it happens with countries that face massive devastation, dictatorship, war, there was so much happening in Iraq, and there was so much death because of the chaos that the U.S. occupation introduced. And the question for me at the time, as for other Iraqi writers or artists, as it is now for Palestinians and Syrians, is like, how do you begin to approach this country that's being destroyed on so many levels in so many ways? And I read a newspaper article about an actual corpse washer who was making so much money because there was so much death.
Right.
But he wanted to quit and leave Iraq because he didn't want his son to inherit this profession. And it was very moving. And right away, it dawned on me. I mean, I had never read about this profession, and I thought this is one of the few professions where one cannot look away and you have to confront death. And right away, I started thinking and changing in my mind, you know, and then it dawned on me also that it's such a rich character and a metaphor that allows me to approach everything almost, other issues and themes also about mortality. And I thought, you know, someone must have already written about this, but I went right away and did research and discovered that no one had written a novel or a short story about it. And I was excited, of course, but then I also it's a daunting subject because, you know, I grew up in a Christian family, but I also grew up in Baghdad. So I did extensive research on the corpse washing rituals in the Islamic tradition, specifically in the Shi'i tradition, and had to immerse myself in all of that because I wanted to inhabit the character and didn't want to write what would sound like something written by someone who lives abroad and has not gone to the country in a long time. I think that's the anxiety that a lot of writers who live abroad and keep writing about their home countries. And, you know, I also surrounded myself in my apartment at the time with images of death and destruction and clippings so that I could approximate how this Jawad was, who had to deal with death every day. So, alhamdulillah, it worked out because the most rewarding thing for me is some of the emails I get from Iraqis. Or when I went to Baghdad in 2019 for the book fair, someone took me aside and told me, how long did you work as a corpse washer? Or when I tell my colleagues, you know, if I get fired, then I can maybe
work as a corpse washer.
But it might sound cheesy, but I think it's also about passion and love. You know, we talked about labor, but I think if, you know, one is passionate and curious, there's the anxiety of the first work, and you know, one always wants to try to make a splash or write something different, right? Make it different. Yeah. And to be honest with you, in Iraq in the 80s, when I, you know, became interested in being a writer, everything was controlled by the state, and everything was censored. And by and large, you would get published if you wrote positively about the regime or about the war with Iran. And if I may toot my horn, I'm proud to say that I'm one of the few who didn't want to engage in all of that. And that caused me for a long time bitterness because I wasn't included in any of these literary groups. I wasn't published. The first text that I published was published by a journal in Paris. And it's important to remind people that throughout the 80s, whether in the United States or in the so-called free world, the regime of Saddam Hussein was praised as the secular regime fighting the forces of darkness of Iran.
Right.
And even in the Arab world, people did not know what it meant to live under a dictatorship. So I always wanted to write a novel about what it means to live in a dictatorship. But also I wanted the form to be different. And language is always so important in all regimes, whether democracies, fascist democracies, or dictatorships, and especially in the Ba'ath Party, which ruled Iraq, there was such a focus on language itself. But for me, how would a prisoner be able to write without being caught? And there is this particularity with Arabic about the dots. So many of the letters you could write without the dots, and you can guess the meaning from context and from grammar. And this historically was the way Arabic was written. So that it started out as a short story, but then it grew. And with this idea is so rich to explore because of ambiguity and also how meaning shifts and how authority and power cannot monopolize meaning. And there is always this space for parody. So that's why, and it helped that initially my classmate in junior high school in Baghdad used to write his diaries while he sat next to me without dots. He could understand what he's writing, and I could figure it out. And later, and also in studying pre-modern Arabic culture and literature, the issue of manuscripts also came back. So all of these things came together. To have a novel whose form is in harmony with its meaning and what it's trying to say. I don't know if I'm proud of something, but I should say that, again, this is dating us and showing our age. But as I said, I didn't publish anything in Iraq because I didn't want to write jingoistic poems and short stories about whatever. And then when I took a few of my texts to the literary editor of Al Jumhuriyya at the time, one of them was about a mother whose son comes back from the war with Iran in a coffin. And he said, this is, not mobilizational, mutabawiyya. But there was a magazine that was published in Paris called Al-Yawm Al-Sabi' in the late 80s. And it had interesting cultural pages. And I sent them by mail. Back then, again, there was no internet. I sent them by mail a short poetic text that was about living in the city and feeling that one is imprisoned and there is no hope. And they published it. And that was, looking back, this is one of the moments of kind of pure joy, because for a young aspiring writer, being recognized by literary editors who were some important names in the Arab world, that kind of gave me faith and encouraged me to move forward. So I think that's one of the moments that I can think of. I know it's not easy, but I would say resist all the institutional pressures and do not write what's expected of you to write. And, because we are, not only as writers, just as citizens, are pigeonholed in certain categories and whatnot. And so just be different and be radical and be truthful to the material reality. Imagination and aesthetics are crucial, of course, but the material reality and the socioeconomic conditions and power, be critical of all types of power, institutional and otherwise. It's a tall order, but if you want to write what will endure, and also just write like the elders and the masters that you admire. A friend of mine told me years ago when my first novel, Ajam, was rejected by all the big publishers. I mean, thanks to City Lights, because they always take chances with different types of writing. When I told this friend, all these big publishers refused my novel, he said, that's good. He said, because if they had accepted your novel, I would be worried about what's in the novel. So this is the advice that actually, don't be seduced by temporary attention, which is fleeting. And especially for those of us who come from the Arab world and the global South, there is this a mixture of liberal guilt and extractive approach, whereby if you are connected to or come from a country that was just beset by war or disaster, there is this temporary attention on you, and then they move on to something else. So write for your communities and you know. Itel Adnan for sure. And I am biased. Sargon Bolus came from an Assyrian family, but he was also included in the Arab American sphere because he wrote in Arabic and lived such a long time. So Itel Adnan, Sargon Bolus, and if you ask me about younger emerging voices, there are a lot of voices. There's Rasha Abdul Hadi, I think, a young poet, radical poet, whose poetry and whose stance I really admire.